All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to this week's Chalk Talk. We have Dr. Nefertiti Walker with us. Neff and I have known each other since grad school back at Florida, and happy to call her a friend and a colleague. And Neff, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to pitch it over to you, let you introduce yourself, and then we'll get some Q&A going.
Absolutely. Happy to be here and good to see you. Good to see all of you. It's always nice when I can hang out with Jan. I have to try and make it to at least one game, right? I have one game that I'm supposed to make it to every year, and my schedule, my life has been so crazy that I haven't always, but nonetheless, I'm happy to be here today. I'm Neff Walker. I'm a faculty member at UMass Amherst. I'm in the business school here, the Eisenberg School of Management. I'm also the Vice Chancellor for the Office of Equity and Inclusion, as well as the Chief Diversity Officer. And I tell people all the time, I have no idea how I got here. Faculty member, that was very intentional. I put a lot of effort and energy into the PhD process. I knew I wanted to be a professor, probably earlier than I actually acknowledged and said out loud. But that path was a very intentional path that I took. Becoming a practitioner in this world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, absolutely have no idea how that happened, but I'm here and very happy to be doing it. So I'll just share some of my sort of early thinkings towards this topic, how I got here, starting with my professor life and moving into sort of the administrative role, focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion for our campus. I got my PhD, as Jana mentioned, at the University of Florida. There, I knew that I wanted to do sports stuff. I actually, after getting my MBA, I had this moment of trying to understand whether I wanted to get a PhD, whether I wanted to get a JD. My dad told me to speak to 10 lawyers and speak to 10 professors. The faculty members were so in love with their jobs, happy, relaxed, seemed not very stressed. And the lawyers were all stressed and sort of working towards that 15-year point where they felt like they could exhale. And I didn't want to do that. I feel like being a college, I played basketball in college. So I felt like being a college athlete, I was over that level of intensity and wanted to get into a space where I had time to think and breathe and sort of learn who I am and learn who I want to be in this role and how I wanted to leave an impact on the world. So I decided to get my PhD. Love the experience. My research and dissertation work was really trying to understand the lack of inclusion of women in men's sports. So I was really fascinated with the few women who have worked in men's sports, particularly men's basketball, and just how did they survive that culture, right? I mean, we know that sports in general all have these very unique, distinct cultures that are often rooted in whether it's racism, sexism, ableism, on and on and on. So I was really fascinated in how these women were able to function and thrive. And particularly my dissertation looked at men's collegiate basketball. And since then I've gone on to study women working in other predominantly male spaces, whether it be professional sports like the American Hockey League, the NBA, and on. And I think what I learned from this research is that the reasons why these particular women were able to thrive was the sort of specificity of their identities and the intricacies of the areas that they were working in. So they were working in cultures and departments that had something unique about them that allowed them to thrive, something unique about them that act as a barrier to the sexism or racism that they would normally experience in these spaces. And I became really fascinated with that, both from an intersectionality lens, so looking at the ways that their marginalized identities intersected to influence their experiences, but also looking at the ways that organizations can become inclusive. And since then, I've just really sort of honed in and focused in on how I can use experiences, narratives, conversations with people that come from marginalized identities, whether it be disability, whether it be race, gender, religion, whatever it might be. If I can understand the experiences of these people, then I can create spaces that are inclusive to them. And the more identities that are marginalized that I can understand, the more inclusive spaces that I can help create. And that's been my research and my goal ever since. I started doing this because of my research in that area. I started doing more practitioner related work in the DEI space, probably back in 2016. Before then, I was doing work in my professional organizations. I served on DEI committees. I chaired DEI committees, worked on various initiatives for my school, as well as professional organizations. But more formally, I became the director of D&I for our business school back in 2016. And since then, I moved from director to D&I to associate dean of D&I to associate vice chancellor to now vice chancellor. So it's been, I guess, a natural progression. It's just happened very quickly. And I feel like the pandemic sped everything up. Everything feels like either it's taken decades or it's happened in a blink of an eye. And that's how this work has felt for me. It feels like I've progressed to this place in the blink of an eye. But I don't want to talk forever because I want to make sure that we have time for you all to talk. But that's just a brief overview of the research that I do, the work that I do, and a little bit about how I got here.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I do feel like every time I check in on you, you have a new title. Like I just like that's happened.
Higher ed we like titles in higher ed. So I think that's probably most of the reason why. less of what I'm doing and more of just higher ed likes to do that.
Yeah, no, it's the same as you get higher up in athletic departments too. You know, you add the assistant, the associate, the executive. So you kind of talked a little bit about my lead-in question. COVID, I do feel like has sped up a lot in this area. For Clemson personally, we cut track and field. It's been reinstated. We're adding 2 more female sports. We've named a chief diversity officer within the athletic administration. And I know that we're about to launch gender equity captains within the student athletes. So there's new student athlete groups forming. What trends are you seeing, and based with your research too, like how is it impacting like all of this good stuff and this momentum? What trends are you seeing around campuses and the positive change?
Yeah, so I would say it varies by campus, but actually, you know what? I'm sorry, because I know you're recording this, but my inbox beeping every 2 seconds is really annoying me. So I'm just gonna exit out of that. And hopefully that's quiet now. So trends, I think it varies by institution, and it varies depending on where you are in the country. But I think the biggest trend that we're seeing across institutions, regardless of where you are in this country, is that since last summer, particularly the anti-Black racism, and also with the pandemic, the anti-Asian racism, and then coupled with the 2018, 2019 Me Too movement, it's nearly impossible for organizations to ignore race and gender in the ways that we traditionally and historically have, right? Like you can no longer say, oh, I didn't understand that these people were experiencing this culture or this organization differently, because we spent a whole summer of 2020 understanding the ways that people are experiencing organizations differently because of their race. And of course, because of their gender as well in the last 3 or 4 years. So I feel like the biggest trend I've seen, and we saw last summer, all of the statements to end racism and to support, all people and this push towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I loved it. I absolutely loved to see that, mostly because I felt like we needed that re-energizing as a country. And we were all forced to basically sit at home for the most part and take it in. You couldn't hide in the busyness of your day. You couldn't hide because you were on campus or at work doing things. Like you just had to sit at home for parts of last summer and take it in and actually digest what was happening. But I also like it because it's an accountability measure, right? Like at any point when organizations begin to sort of retract into our ways of being exclusionary, people can hold organizations and the leaders their feet to the fire and say, hey, remember in 2020, you said this, right? Like you made this statement publicly. This isn't aligning with my experiences, or this isn't in alignment with the things that you're doing, the way that you're spending resources, your inability to recruit and retain women, for instance, like what's happening here, right? And now organizations have to respond to that. So I think that's the biggest trend, is that leaders know that they made very public statements in support of DEI, and now they have to do the work. And when you think about accountability needs to be aligned with authority, right? So if organizations are accountable because they made these very public statements, then who has the authority to enact these changes that they know have to happen? And I think that's where you're seeing all these new DEI, leadership positions, whether it's an assistant athletic director, associate athletic director, coordinators, because again, someone has to have the authority, someone has to have the responsibility, and it has to be in alignment with their actual daily job. So that's, for me, that's the biggest trend I've seen, is just some people call it a reckoning, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. I think it's accountability. We found a way in that moment of last summer to acknowledge the harm that's been done. And because of those public statements, people are now going to be held accountable in ways they haven't before.
I think there's also been a surge of empowerment from the side requiring the accountability. I wrote down that quote, accountability needs to be aligned with authority. I think that's leadership. Like, that is spot on right there, like from the top down. And we've seen that.
Yeah.
Our AD stepped up, like he's funding the gender equity stuff and some other thing, like from his personal line, so I totally see what you're saying happening firsthand right now. Guys, questions? Just raise hands or hop on. Who's got one? Yes, Sarah.
Well, I guess my group is kind of focusing on the disconnect between student athletes and coaching staffs that maybe differ in like ethnic and racial backgrounds. So I'm not sure if you ever kind of looked into that or researched that by any chance, but it's just been kind of interesting to see like different sports with different, like, I guess, majority ethnic or racial backgrounds among the student athletes, and then coaching staffs that are primarily white or primarily African-American, and the disconnect there that student athletes experience or the coaching experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for me to talk about that piece of it or this topic in general without going back to sort of the socio-historical context of it all, right? So, I mean, historically, we think about this country was raised and created, and most of the organizations were created for very particular groups of people. So here at UMass, I forget what year it was, but we were initially created for men. And at the time it was created for white men, right? So everything since then has been work to create a space that's more inclusive for other groups. Because originally this space, this campus was created for white men, for able-bodied, cisgendered, well-to-do white men, right? Like very particular types of white men. I think it's important to be specific when we talk about these things. Because again, if I just say white men, there are some white men when this UMass, being this organization, was created, that absolutely could not come here, was not welcomed, UMass would want no part of them, right? And we have to work to create a space that's inclusive for those folks as well. But again, I think it's important to think about the socio-historical context of whatever organization you're working in. So if you're thinking about, for instance, a football team, I think we have to think about the socio-historical context of that football team. Who was it created for? And then what work has been done since its creation to make it more inclusive in every aspect for the other people that are now participating, whether it be coaches, trainers, athletes, everyone, right? And if you realize that not a lot of work has been done to actually authentically include these people, then you have work to be done. And that's why you have the disconnect. I think also, historically, when we thought about including people in sports in particular, but in general, it's been, we want to include them as long as they assimilate, right? Like, you get a player on your team and the first thing you want them to do is learn your culture and fit in. You don't necessarily want that player because of the unique aspects of who they are. You don't want them to bring, if they're from rural America, middle America, you don't want them to bring that to the team. You want them to come to a team and you want them to be a mold and model of you want them to be a model of the mold you've created for that team. And you wanted them to assimilate. And I think that's important as well, because I say kids these days, students these days, athletes these days do not want to assimilate. Like, they're not down for it. They don't care about it. You take your assimilation, you take your way of being, and we're going to throw it back at you, because that's not who we are. We want to be authentically, uniquely ourselves, and we want you to accept us as that. And I think that's another part, Sarah, of the disconnect, is that coaches are used to getting athletes to assimilate and shedding a lot of who they are and a lot of their culture to fit in on their team, because they're getting a scholarship, because they want to be a part of the team. And I think, again, athletes today are just, they're not doing it. Like, young people aren't doing it. We've hit this place in time where there's a big shift generationally. And I say generationally, but there are some people that are millennials, older millennials, what do they call it? Geriatric millennials, I think is what I'm technically called now. Xers on and on, that they also are like, you know what? I've been living this life of assimilating into this culture. I want to be like the younger kids. I want to be freer. And they're also pushing and resisting the norms that we've had in our culture to force people to assimilate. So I think that's a big part of it as well. I think our lack of understanding of that these organizations were created for certain groups, and there hasn't been a lot of work, and there needs to be more work to make them more inclusive of a broader group of people, but also just the disconnect between people don't want to assimilate anymore. And the sport culture and sport coaches and administrators haven't been able to keep up with the pace of social change to recognize that.
No, I think that's a great way of putting it. I also think, also with the trends of the transfer portal that's going on in college athletics and the assimilation that is in culture, like that intersection is messier than it's ever been. We had a question, and Craig, I'm going to rephrase it, but basically, if you were asked about, and Craig, if you don't like the way I ask it, do you want to go ahead?
No, ma'am. Please proceed.
So I think, like, if someone came to you, if a group came to you, if a company came to you to ask about policies on hiring as it refers to, to DEI, like what would your advice be around hiring? Is that okay, Craig?
That's great.
Okay.
Much broader. I like it.
Okay.
I think with hiring, one, organizations aren't built to change. They're built to replicate themselves over and over, and the way that they do things over and over and over again. So to actually change organizations, and leaders are a big part of organizations, you have to first be open to doing things differently. And when we think about recruiting in particular, organizations and leaders want to recruit the same ways they've always recruited. They want to go to the same top schools, the same top programs. They want to go to their buddies and their networks. They want to go to what they call tried and true ways of doing this. And that's where they want to find their people, right? Like, they don't want to sort of sit back and think and interrogate their recruiting process to say, this is what we're missing from our organization. This is the way that we've found the people that are here. We have to do something distinctly different to find different people. Whether it's in where you're finding these people early on in the recruiting process, whether it's how you're treating these people, or even your minimum qualifications, right? I mean, this is probably a bad example, but the first one I can think of is the tech industry. The tech industry realized that, hey, we're getting the same sort of people in our organizations, yet there's no reason why we aren't more diverse. I mean, half of the jobs you can work remotely. Like, there's so much flexibility in the actual work life. Why does everyone look, behave, think, act the same, and come from the same institutions? And what they realize is that their requirements for the job was not necessary. I mean, to require a degree for some of the things that people can do in tech is just not necessary, right? So what they did is they just stopped requiring degrees. You see Google, for instance, and I know Google is like the echelon of the tech world, but they, as well as much smaller startups, have been able to just get rid of a lot of their minimum qualifications because they were excluding people that could help them become more diverse and that can actually make them more innovative, because there's all sorts of research that aligns diversity with innovation, progress, performance, as well as return on investment. So these organizations know this now, and they're doing everything they can to increase that diversity so that they can then increase all of these outcomes of diversity. And so to answer your question, I think it's being willing to do something different in how you recruit people, the places you recruit people from, and even your recruitment process, and interrogating why you think you should do things the way you've always done them. Another example is the SAT, right? I mean, I think most institutions, and here at UMass, the last 2 cycles, because of the pandemic, SAT is optional, right? Standardized test score is optional for us. we've always held on to it. We being higher ed academia, we've held on to the fact that if we don't have SAT scores, we're not going to be able to figure out who to actually enroll into our institutions, right? Like it's something that we've held on to, and it's been such a big part of how we've recruited students, who we've allowed into our spaces. And then a pandemic comes along and we're like, oh yeah, we're going to get rid of that because we can't use it because people literally physically can't get to the testing locations. And the world went on, and we're admitting students. And for a lot of institutions here at UMass, we've admitted our most diverse group of students the last 2 years, not having that requirement for SATs. So, and also our most accomplished group of students. So again, something that we've held on to as an absolute necessary item for recruiting people into our organization, we now know is not necessary and has actually acted as a barrier to diversity. So I think just interrogating your ways of recruitment and the ways that you onboard people and the ways that you look to fill pools of candidates is going to be a good first start.
Craig, a good answer. I mean, I thought it was pretty good. So
I thought that was an awesome answer to your question.
do you want to ask yours more specifically?
No, I think that was probably better for the
Okay.
group.
Okay. So Chet asked, and Chet, I'll do my best here too. Chet asked Neff, like based on your time as a, educator and also a practitioner in this field, do you remember maybe a particular like heart change moment or maybe a light bulb moment from doing that work, and maybe what that lesson was? Is that something you could share with us?
For me, or for like maybe the industry, I'm not sure, Chet, which, if it's for me personally, I don't know if I've had a light bulb moment. I've always sort of felt the need at a very early age to advocate for people. Whether my parents taught me at a very early age how to advocate for myself. I have a disabled brother who I've always felt compelled to advocate for at a very early age as well. So I think the idea of advocacy and trying to understand the experiences of those that are marginalized is something that, I've always done. I think an aha moment of, okay, maybe I should be doing this work is when probably in the pandemic and dealing with some of the biggest crises you can imagine. I don't know if any of you saw, probably, maybe not, but we had a pretty significant anti-Black racist incident happen on our campus back in September. And we were completely, it was a pile-on from New York Times to Boston Globe, on and on and on about this incident. And I felt, it was stressful, but I was able to manage it. I feel like pretty successfully. And I was also pretty comfortable in the mess of it all. And I was like, okay, maybe I should be doing this work, right? Like I'm able to do this and keep my sanity. Maybe this is the right place for me. So I think it's something that I've always wanted to do, generally speaking, and I've always done, advocating for more inclusive spaces where everyone can feel a sense of belonging. But I feel like the pandemic has shown me that this is the place that I need to be right now in my life.
I totally get what you're saying. I have similar feelings when I'm in the locker rooms with teams, and it's like, like when you kind of see their eyes change and their posture changes, and you're like, okay, I this is where I'm supposed to be in this moment.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So
Hey, Neff, this is Chet. Sorry, I found a quiet
thanks,
place.
Chet.
Sorry, I can't actually turn on my video right now because
no worries.
But that was a great answer. I want to press just a bit more into it. Is there I was checking out your CV, and you have so much tremendous experience traveling, not only within the country, but also abroad. Is there a specific time, like in one of those experiences? I'm sure all of them were really great. Is there one experience that you had there that stood out and you were like, this is a really cool moment? Like people here are getting it. Or like maybe another way of putting it is there one experience that stood out to you, at least pops up in the forefront of your memory and says like, I would go back and do that again? Like what was that experience and why does that stand out above other ones?
That is a tough question. So I have two answers to the question. If I'm just thinking about in life in general, The last year of my PhD program, I had an opportunity to go to East Africa. So I went to Tanzania, Arusha, Tanzania, and I went to Nairobi, Kenya. And I was doing some research there on trying to understand their sport governance and culture, et cetera, et cetera. And it was just to see people up. First of all, it was a bit frustrating because they operate, time is not of the essence, generally speaking, in East Africa, and that every meeting that we had was like, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours late. So it definitely created patience for me, which I'm normally an impatient person when I'm trying to get work done. But also it just allowed me to see the different ways that this work can be done, leadership, sport leadership, that centers different ways of being, right? So in being in Kenya, for instance, and thinking about sport leadership, sport governance, they centered their cultural experiences in everything, right? It was absolutely formal. Yes, it was business as usual, but every meeting started, and this is the same for Sao Paulo, Brazil, when I went there to do some research as well. They centered their the aspects of their culture that to me seems very social and humane in the work that they did. So a meeting is starting, people are late, it's no big deal, have a coffee. And I'm like, wait, we have business. Like, I need to get this interview done. And they're like, don't worry about it, we'll get it done. Let's have a coffee, right? So everything, the person is always centered, the person, the well-being of the person. They were able to see sometimes that I was very anxious because we were running late and I didn't think I would be able to get the interview done. And they're like, hey, we're going to get the interview done, but let's just sit and talk and find out how's your day going first, right? Foods were very important, like centering meetings around whether people were hungry or not, whether they had enough coffee, like just again, the very humane. And I feel like, at least in my experiences working in higher ed, yes, there are meetings where we have food and it's sort of often thrown at you, right? It's like, oh, there's some food over there in the corner. Anyways, let's get back to this agenda. I try to bring a piece of that back with me to the States, a piece of centering the person in every interaction. So starting meetings with like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? You want to grab a coffee? We have time for you to grab a coffee and come back. Like, just really trying to center that person's well-being and then getting into the business of whatever you're doing. And I found that that's changed me and my work by allowing people to sort of exhale. Like when I have meetings and I do that and I center the person and their well-being in that meeting, they show up differently. They show up, they're not as uptight. They're able to relax, and I'm able to get people in positions where they can be a little bit more vulnerable, which means we can do the work. Because if people aren't vulnerable and talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can't really get a lot of work done. So I would say that
that is so wicked cool, Dr. Walker. Have you ever read Brene Brown? I'm sure you have.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, of course. Yes. Jana has had us read Brene Brown often, and you're just reminding me a lot of that work.
No, I love her and her work. She has, I don't know if you all have seen her Netflix special as well, which is pretty good.
I haven't, but gosh, I need to. That sounds great.
Yes, you should. Yeah, you
what
should
is it
definitely
called?
watch it. It's maybe some vulnerability. I mean, I know all of her work centers on vulnerability, but I think that's actually the name of it.
Okay.
Chad, I'll look it up. I'll look it up for you. But
thank you.
If you're going to watch anything from her, definitely the Netflix, and also her first TED Talk on shame and vulnerability.
Yeah.
Gosh, so good.
Which I think is the one that I have in the class.
Mm-hmm.
Chad, did you have another question? If not, we're going to move over to Caitlin.
I do, but I can ask it later if someone else wants to ask a question.
Yeah, let's spread the love a little bit. So Caitlin, I think you have one, and then we'll move over to Destiny.
Hi, Dr. Walker. My name is Caitlin. I'm the graduate assistant for Clemson women's basketball. And you spoke earlier about how women were thriving in some of the earlier places in your work. And I was wondering, what are some of the characteristics that those places had that you would want to duplicate in any places moving forward?
Leadership that was open and felt like diversity and inclusion was important to them, like showed it, right? I think about some of the women that worked again on men's college basketball teams. They had leaders who were very open and celebrating things like Women's History Month, right? I mean, it seems like not a big deal, right? But you have a men's basketball team talking about Women's History Month and the importance of it. You have them celebrating the women and girls in sports. I forget the name of the sports day. That's like January 6th or something like that. That happens. No, February 6th. That happens every year. They were very active in that. They asked their, male athletes to go to the women's sporting events. So the one characteristic that I saw that was really important to these women being able to thrive was inclusive leaders, head coaches, athletic directors that valued them, but also valued their differences, right? And valued who they were as individuals. Not asking them to do the more maternal type jobs on the team, but acknowledging that these women in particular, about half of them were mothers. So acknowledging where we are as a society and the need for them to have to spend time with their kids in ways that some of the men coaches didn't, because again, where we are as a society, right? Expectations, not because necessarily these men didn't want to spend time with their families, just that the expectations were such that they would put more time and energy into work. And then even having a coach that I can remember, a coach that was in the SEC and had a woman on his staff, which I can't say the name, so sorry about that. But he went as far as to making sure that all the people on the staff felt that they can parent in the same ways that he had been enlightened to the one woman on his staff was parenting, right? So he recognized that she was just not going to put certain things above time with her kids, and he created space for the whole staff to do that and encourage these men to go out and spend more time with their families and do other things while also still coaching a really, really, really good team. So, I think it's leadership. It starts with leadership, and it starts with inclusive leadership in particular. And inclusive leadership as an ideal wasn't that well known back then. Like, people didn't talk about inclusive leadership the way that they do now. It wasn't really this theoretical frame, but they absolutely were engaging in inclusive leadership and the tenets of inclusive leadership.
I just had one follow-up statement.
Yeah.
After your answer, would you think that moving forward to close the gap in gender, it would be more just open leadership would be what could really move us forward in terms of leveling the playing ground between female and male coaches in college athletics?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think inclusive, if we think about inclusive leadership, that's absolutely going to get us closer there because of the ideals of courage and empathy and on and on and on. But I also think we have to when we think about accountability, there has to be metrics of accountability, right? We just can't say, oh, you have to be accountable for, creating diversity and being more equitable. We actually have to develop measurements of what does it mean to be accountable when we think about equity in college athletics, right? And those standards have to be set and normalized either at the organizational level, so the athletic director and their staff, the institution level, so maybe it's someone like in my role for the entire institution that's setting those standards, which we're going to do here at UMass over the course of the next year, or it comes from the industry, right? The NCAA comes out and says, this is what it looks like to have an equitable coaching staff. People are paid, the same for the same amount of experience, expertise, et cetera, et cetera. Opportunities for advancement looks like this, but you have to actually set some sort of metrics and you have to measure them over some period of time, and then you have to report them, and someone has to be responsible for oversight of these metrics so that they can ensure that people are improving. Just to say we're going to be inclusive and not actually be able to measure what that looks like is not very helpful. I mean, that's what we've been doing at most institutions for the last 15 or 20 years, and it's not gotten us that far. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Go ahead, Destiny.
Hi, my name is Destiny Coleman, and I work as an academic coordinator, and I asked a question in the chat, but to preface it a little bit more, I'm trying to distinguish what my role is with DEI in this new role within the office, but then individually with my teams. So I work with tennis and track and football and squash, so very different sports, very different diversity issues to say. So what's the best way to kind of navigate where we are between those sports and then as well as my position and what I've done with DEI, with my office?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think what makes thinking about DEI so difficult for us as practitioners is that we're still not at a place where we're treating DEI like we treat HR in general, or like we treat the budget. You know, we have to have this annual budget report every year. We have these metrics that measure how healthy we are or not with the budget. We have very specific requests for budgets. We have very specific items that go into budgets based on the sport, based on the coach, based on the year. And we haven't quite gotten to a place where we think about diversity the same way, right? I mean, those teams that you named, they have very different diversity, equity, and inclusion needs based on who they are and where they are right now in their journey of becoming diverse, equitable, and inclusive, right? And I think each of them have to be treated differently based on where they are and based on their capacity for growth each year. Some teams, you know, let's say it's football, for instance, they have a much more significant, they have a higher capacity for growth around diversity and equity and inclusion because they just have more money, right? So if they decide that it's important to them, then they can just put the money literally where their mouth is and support certain things within their organization because they have the resources to do that. You have other teams who may have far less resources, and they're going to have to prioritize exactly what's important to them right now, what's most dire to them right now, and then move forward. So for instance, I think about our program here at UMass, something that we prioritized as an athletic department last year was support, social, psychological, therapeutic, mental health support for our student athletes, particularly our Black student athletes last summer, right, with all that was happening in the country. And also support for our allies, right? So for folks that aren't Black, to one, be educated and develop some trainings around these topics of DEI, but also to understand how to be an ally, how to be an active bystander to racism, et cetera, et cetera. And those were our priorities. So we put resources, funds, we created time, people put effort towards that last year, understanding that we still have a long ways to go in all these other areas, and teams have very specific goals as well, but as an organization, that was prioritized for us. So I think, you know, thinking about your job, which is very difficult when you're having to manage different, it's a lot easier if you're a coach for a particular team. It's much more difficult if you're working at the intersections of academic success and athletics and DEI, because you just have so many other things to consider. So, you know, I would say lay it all out by team, lay out their very unique, specific needs related to DEI, and then lay it out for your unit as well, and lay out, again, your very specific needs for DEI, and then prioritize, get groups of people together that have the authority to actually say how you're going to use or allocate resources, and prioritize the use of those resources based on those needs.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Neff. This one's we're going to shift a little bit. Are you good with an NIL question?
Yes, I may not have the answer, but I'm good with it.
Well, basically, James would like to know, how would you describe your experiences so far with NIL, the new laws, and what do you think has been the most impactful aspect of them as it relates to student athletes?
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question well because I haven't had the opportunity to really dive deeply into what's happening, right? I mean, I sort of live in the time in between thinking about DEI for our campus. I live sort of just in the women's basketball world because I'm just a women's basketball fan, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what a lot of people have been paying attention to is trying to make sure there is some equity in the market, right? I mean, in this country, we tend to let the market speak for itself. Although those who understand economics understands that the market isn't this thing that isn't controlled by humans. Humans absolutely control the market itself in the decisions we make, but also in the decisions that we don't make, and the people that we uphold, the people that we don't, et cetera, et cetera. We're actually controlling the market. And I think people that think about DEI are just interested in watching whether the market is going to reflect what we see in the broader society, right? Is the market going to look like Power 5 conferences? Is it going to look like the NCAA, where there are absolutely haves and have-nots? And early on, I think we're recognizing that, yes, right? Like it is going to look like college sports in general, where you have the haves and you have the have-nots, and the have-nots will most likely never make it to the folks who are getting the big bucks unless they make significant changes by institution, affiliation, et cetera, et cetera. So again, not a very good answer because I just haven't been able to spend a lot of time diving into it, but I do know those are some of the questions that I have, and I think others in this space have.
Thanks for that. And we're coming up on 11:15. Yeah, I think it's a really hard time to be a mid-major right now with everything with NIL and transfers. It's just,
Yeah.
I think it's a really tough spot to be. I would not want to be there right now, but
Yeah.
we'll also see how the transfer portal, that impact unfolds too. But thank you so much for your time. I've had
Yeah, of
students
course.
messaging me on the side, taking a bunch of notes. I have a bunch of notes. I'm probably going to tweet at you. So I can't thank you enough. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, guys. Anything else before we say goodbye other than just gratitude?
Yeah, it's good chatting with you all. I enjoy this. You all have very good questions, so thank you for the questions and the time. And Jan, is always good to see you, Doc. So
It's good to see you.
thank you for
too.
having me.
Yep, we'll catch up non-professionally soon.
Perfect. Have a good Thanksgiving break, folks. Take care.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.